sort of a different conception of feminine beauty. It's more ascetic, more skinnier, I guess would be a good technical word for it, compared to that lovely face there. And then this is the last one I put up at the very end, because it's another female figure, in fact the same, supposedly, as that, Mary Magdalene. Could they be by the same artist? I'm not honestly so sure. This seems different to me. But the same attributes. Remember the ointment jar that she has for anointing Christ's feet. And another lovely bit of sleeve. Amazingly good stuff. Look at that lovely sleeve there. And you can, you can. I said before, you could reproduce furniture, workshop tools, and now clothes. Look how it sort of laces up the middle. There's really clever ones for breastfeeding mothers that have this sort of lacy thing here, and you just kind of undo that bit, and then do your lunch, and then put it all back in again. Very efficient. There's a Leonardo da Vinci that has that, which is rather nicely done. Beautiful landscape in behind. Lovely modern dress, hat, very fashionable. She's crying. Oh dear. Normally crying people, that's honest Ed sort of stuff, is not painted on velvet. I think that Roger is about the only person at this time who can paint tears with genuine emotion. He's awfully good at it, and the sort of eyes welling up. We'll see other examples in just a minute. So anyway, that's this one. Quite solidly painted, but doesn't really matter. But that is actually the right-hand part of a folding-up triptych. When you're in the Louvre and you're looking at that picture by Jan van Eyck of Chancellor Rollin, you flip around 180 degrees. Behind you is this one. Well, it was not. They keep changing things around without warning me, so you go there the next time and everything's different. But it was not when I was there before. And again, it's not that huge. I'll tell you when we get to the hugely important ones. This is just nice to look at. It's called the Braque Triptych, B-R-A-Q-U-E, named after Mr. Braque. So it's about 15 years after the Reading Magdalene. It's only about 16 inches high, but not much, foot a little bit high. And again, it's a folding up triptych. So this is yet another one that's for a private home, for private worship. You could carry it around with you, I guess, when you're traveling. And this fellow, Jean Braque, he actually died in 1492. And he'd only just got married, basically. So this picture was commissioned by his widow. And all of this stuff implies money, because these things obviously aren't going to be cheap at all. When you fold up the wings, you get this rather delightful, I think I'd keep it open most of the time, the skull. When you see a skull like that, it's called a memento mori, a reminder of death. And or something just vanitas in Latin, because in the book of Leviticus or something, some Old Testament book says vanity of vanity, all is vanity. All of the material world, all of our material ideas and hopes and all add up to nothing on Judgment Day. So that's what we're going to end up at, and that's the family coat of arms there. There's actually an inscription over here on the cross which reads in translation, "My body was once beautiful, but now is food for worms." So watch it. And it's all to do with the saving of your soul and things like that. But again, it's a little bit gruesome to have that in the living room, particularly if you've got a dead husband. Anyway, back to this. Remember the three wings. Again, it's so nicely done. John the Baptist, I think they're slightly more individualized. Most of the other images of these various saints are a little bit more stereotyped. But you get the idea, again, of this sort of loony guy who's been out in the desert. Literally saying, behold the Lamb, behold the Lamb of God. That's about the only words he gets to say in the Bible. And the Lamb of God, of course, is Christ. So he's going point into the middle, which of the thing which is where Christ is. But a beautiful landscape again. See that, if I can zoom in a tiny bit more, miniaturistically, can you just see that? There's the actual baptism. Can you see that right there? I mean, he's almost pointing right at Christ. There's one who cometh after me. Anyway, that's rather nice. And again, he's good at teeth, is old Roger. He seems to like teeth because quite often the lips are parted, which mostly, I bet if you look through all of Van Eyck, people keep their mouths shut. It's not terribly important, but something to think about. And nicely individual, again, the furrowed brows, things like that. That's very good. The hair is always good. And the central part is kind of, remember we saw the deesis, D-E-E-S-I-S, in the Ghent altarpiece, where you have Christ between Mary, his mother, and John the Baptist. In this case, flipped around a bit. John in the wing, and John the Evangelist here with his cup of poison, remember. But this is a very strange image of Christ. And we saw a little bit this kind of thing for, even in the Ghent altarpiece, that kind of Byzantine. He's called the Pantocrator, the creator of all things. And you'll be familiar in Byzantine art, that kind of rather ominous, staring figure. He's very much God the judge, telling you to behave yourself, to smarten up. Again, maybe in the context of this, which is dedicated to the recently deceased fellow, maybe the idea of judgment and wishing for the going out there. Exactly what he's saying there is, in translation, I am the living bread, because bread, obviously, the Eucharist, the Mass, takes the bread, takes the wine, this is my body, this is my blood. But it's very hypnotic, this kind of a traditional way of showing Christ. So this is a good course, actually, because you will all behave yourselves after this course, because you're going to be... wait a few more minutes, I'm going to scare the hell out of you, because if you misbehave, you can see what's going to happen to you. So, again, I should be charging slightly extra for this course. I'm going to save your souls. A lovely figure of Mary, not quite sure what she's saying, but very gentle. Remember, these are the sort of intercessors, because Christ is so remote and kind of distant. Christ/God, because remember, it's part of the Trinity. So if you're going to say your prayers, you're more likely to say them to her, and she'll put in a good word for you. And the other side, John, again, it's nicely individualized. You don't see anybody looking quite like that in the work of other artists at this time. I mentioned that there were dozens of artists working in something like Bruges and Ghent, and I mean, we have the names, we have the guild lists of who were the independent masters. But there's very, very few pictures by each one, and they tend to be all kind of lumped together. When these pictures come up for sale at auction, for example, you're not going to say it's by Joe whatever, because that's not going to make much money. So you say School of Jan van Eyck. They're always kind of promoted up to the highest possible level. And again, what I said about the training method when you did your apprenticeship system, and basically for years and years and years, you were painting your master's pictures because that was your job, basically, to recreate his style. So then to break out on your own and be different, I said there's a grey area between what might be early Roger and late Compin, because Roger worked with Compin, but he does, I think, go his own way rather nicely, more so than most other artists at this time. And again, back to the Mary Magdalene, very restrained, very gentle, lovely hair, that's nice. Again, height of fashion, that sort of idea. So this is her kind of quietly sitting within the landscape. I'm sure, let me just see if I can go. Oops, hang on, that's the wrong thing. There's something going on over... Nah, I think it's just people wandering around. Not quite sure if it's significant or not. Anyway, so that's her behaving, and this is her. Mary Magdalene, usually she is kind of the emotional one. In crucifixion scenes, she is the one who's howling and yelling and waving her arms around, whereas everybody else is getting sort of quietly involved in the scene. And here she is here. You can see the wringing of the hands, for example, the loss of self-control, I guess you could say, with uncontrollable grief. And that picture, that detail, is from, because somebody's kindly holding her ointment jar for her, because she's going to drop it because of all of this stuff, probably. That's from this picture here, which is, I've just been looking at this a few weeks ago in the Prado in Madrid. It's again, I have to keep saying that, you don't have to be Christian to appreciate these sorts of things. Because, well, I'm a lapsed Christian, which is almost worse. But, you come around the corner into a room, you just hang on the wall, and it just kind of grabs you. There's something magnetic about this. There's other amazingly good things on the wall, and you get sucked right over to look at this one. And that's something, again, that keeps cropping up in the way we look at this stuff, because when you take a picture like this out of the context of what it was painted for, because this is now big, how big is it? 7'3", by 8'7". That's over 2 meters high. That's pretty long. So this is now to go into a church, in a chapel behind the altar. And I've said this before, I think, with that you have candles in front of it, flickering light, bringing things, usually in a semi-dark interior in the chapel, with, you know, not much natural light at all. And then, of course, you have to throw in the smell of the incense. If you're lucky, the sound of music. That's always the big bonus, I think, if you're in the European churches. If somebody starts playing an organ, if you're really lucky, a choir starts to sing. Because then you get what I call the liturgical arts all rolled up here. Because this is the only part of it. This is what you see. But there's the smelling, the listening, all the other stuff that comes into it as well. But when you imagine, as I said, this is down in an art gallery, you see sort of like that, flat on the wall. But if you imagine this is in the chapel, it hangs behind the altar. It's an altar piece. So in front of it is the altar with candles on it. But Christ is being lowered down and almost as if out of the picture into the altar in the actual church, because the altar is the symbolic tomb of Christ in the sort of geography of the church, I guess you could call it. Altar equals tomb. So here he comes down from the cross out into our space almost, and you know, in a very realistic kind of way, to be lowered down into the tomb. Because that's what this picture is. It's called the deposition. There is, I mean, the crucifixion itself, then the deposition, which is Christ being taken down from the cross, and then the entombment. Well, actually, sometimes in between, there's something lovely called the lamentation, which some of you know, I know, because Giotto does a particularly good one of his frescoes in Padua, and that's when Christ is lying on the ground and the mourners are all clustered around. Then the entombment, when he's actually put in the tomb. The tomb was owned by this fellow here, unfortunately another Joseph. There are all these Marys, now we've got 2 Josephs. His name was Joseph of Arimathea. Don't worry about the name. But anyway, he lent, well, he didn't know he was lending it because he didn't know that Christ would be out of there in 3 days. He gave up his sort of family tomb, kind of cave, for the use of Christ's body. And the other fellow who stands over here is his friend Nicodemus, Nicodemus. And if you know Michelangelo's favourite Middle Pietà, it's actually Nicodemus' support figure of Christ from behind. It's a kind of an abstract thing rather than this very specific one. And Michelangelo includes his own self-portrait as Nicodemus. Anyway, here we come. As I said, it's about a bit over 2 meters high, and it's in the Prado. But it was actually painted for a guild of archers, of bowmen, you know, soldiers, in the town of Louvain. But then it ended in the collection of Philip II of Spain, who was a pretty rotten king in a lot of ways. He's the, if you know any English history, he married Bloody Mary, the daughter of Henry VIII, and trying to get England back into the Catholic fold. But at this time, all the area we're looking at, in what's now Belgium, and the northern part, which is now the Netherlands, that was all basically part of the Spanish Empire. That's why there's a huge influence of the art of this area going down to Spain. And that's why a lot of the pictures like this are in Spain. Lots of Bosches and things like that, they're all down in the Prado, because Philip II got his hands on them. So anyway, that's what we're looking at here. And what we see is, well, there are 10 almost life-size figures. And again, I think the bigness of them adds very much to the impact. Set off against this solid gold background. And other crucifixions and things, you get a nice little landscape you can wander off in and sort of go for a little stroll. Here it's just, it's almost claustrophobic, isn't it? How you're kind of kept into the foreground. And the whole scene becomes very isolated in space and in time, because there's no actual setting. Now it's a kind of frozen moment, basically, abstracted from any sense of reality. Because even though, as I said, he's sort of coming down into the altar/tomb, nobody's really going anywhere, I don't think. So rather cramming together of all the figures in the sort of writhing mass of humanity that we see here, but very cleverly controlled. There's sort of almost a W shape of a composition. You can see the bracketing figures on either side. You've got Mary Magdalene on this side and John the Evangelist on that side, which kind of hold the composition together. So it's clearly well thought out. You don't just throw everything into the into the picture. And extraordinarily rich surface patterns, all the various textures of the materials, the faces, the stubble and things like that. The variety of visual information really is quite wonderful. So Christ's body has been removed from the cross. A helpful angel up here who's sort of handing him down. Is it an angel or is it? No, it might be just a regular guy. And again, there's a famous Rubens where, I don't know if any of you took my Baroque course, but one Rubens is Christ being raised on the cross, and there's about 18 guys all drunken and groaning and straining, and they all look like Arnold Schwarzenegger in his prime, on steroids. And the lowering from the cross like this one, my sort of question is, how many people to raise the cross, 17 Muslim, how many people to take him down? Actually nobody, because he just sort of hovers, because he's now, it's just the hollow shell, the husk. And it's almost like that here, but there's no real sense of the actual weight of the figure. He just kind of floats in a sort of divine space somehow. But even here, remember we're talking about Mary holding the Christ out, and all the book, all these sacred objects, and all the, during the celebration of the Mass, you hold the plate and the cup with the cloth, because they're sacred objects. I mean, here is the actual body of Christ still being held by the cloth to emphasize how holy that is. Wearing the crown of thorns, and that was a kind of little bonus extra torture thing. They had so much fun crucifying Christ. So they put this little fake crown on his head. It was made of thorns, so he always had blood pouring down his head. Remember the fifth wound of the crucifixion, because it's quite enough to have in your hands and your feet, but then towards the end of the crucifixion, some nice fellow comes along and thrusts a lance, a spear into Christ's side, so that's the fifth wound there. And realistically done, as if, because Christ has been vertical until pretty recently, so the blood falling in the right way. And I know there's just so many bits and pieces as you travel around the composition. Again, the expressions on the faces are so nicely done. This very solicitous face of old Joseph there. Mary is nearly always shown as still being sort of young and beautiful, and again that kind of idea of the beautiful soul reflected in the beautiful exterior. And here she's absolutely grief-stricken. I mean, that sweaty hair, and the teeth slightly bared, tears pouring down her cheeks, and still wearing what would, for them, be, 1435, 40 or so is the date of this, that headdress with the scalloped edges. We've seen that before. And a lovely, I'll show you another detail in just a minute. The one that actually that sort of bothers me is this bit here. Go back to the overall thing. See, the skull, the hand, the foot. Slightly awkward, that little area. I think I would have, if I was standing there watching it, I would paint it, I'd say, can you do that a bit differently, please? But you know who's the skull? Who? No, he's over there. Any advance on Jesus? Think back a bit. It's Adam. Who? Again, if you know Piero Francesca, he's perhaps the best known artist who paints the legend of the true cross. Don't forget, nearly all of this stuff, the early saints and everything, there was no factual historical evidence of what they did, but there was an oral tradition about all these lovely old saints and people like that. I mean, apart from the Bible, even the Bible was very selective what they chose to be officially in it and officially not. And I think I mentioned this, Jacopo della Voragine was a fellow who wrote a book called The Golden Legend, and he pulled together all these stories and wrote them down in the 13th century. And one of the stories is that, it's about the individual saints, what have you, but also about the cross itself, which started out, the wood of the cross came from a tree that grew on Adam's grave, basically. And then eventually all sorts of wonderful, exciting stories about it, and it comes around full circle when Christ is crucified, sort of on that spot. So when you see the skull, that's Adam, and Christ is the new Adam. Because if it hadn't been for him messing up, Christ wouldn't need to be here yet. That sort of idea. So that's whenever you see the skull and or bones at the foot of the cross, now you know who that is. Yeah, you can amaze your friends from now on with all this useless information. Then just zooming in. He's such a good hand man, isn't it? Look at the hand. It's not that mobile, but just the, the touch of the hand on the shoulder, the dirty fingernails, the wrinkled knuckles and things. It's wonderful. And again, that, the extra labour into doing that beautifully intricate. The framing of the face, as I said, the sweaty hair. But the eyeballs seem to be sort of rolling back in her head as if she's swooning. And I love the paralleling of the hands, one fainting, one dead. And that might be a tiny bit wrong. I mean, it's a bit disgusting, but I think if your hand was flat up against a cross like that, you might not have quite the pattern of blood, but it's sort of almost becomes flower-like, almost like a sort of an anemone, decorative at the back of his hand. And then the other faces, I mean, there's John the Evangelist himself, who is so expressive, weeping again. We've seen that quite often. And then this extraordinary woman in the background. These are the other Marys, I guess, because there's, again, far too many Marys in the Bible, all sobbing away. And this one, look at if I've got the detail even more. Yeah, look at because again, she's wearing the modern headdress, because we've seen in the portraits. We've seen the pin and all the other stuff, as a bunch of stuff. So what she's done here is it's sort of tucked in under there, and it would have been tucked in under the other side. So she's pulled that bit out from the other side and using that to kind of press into her eyes. But she's pushing so hard the tears are actually coming out the top of her eyes, basically. And it's a very real kind of, I mean, sometimes people are weeping in art and it's just a kind of superficial pseudo-weeping. This is real weeping, because when you weep, you usually rather ugly, you kind of, you swell up a little bit. So there's no attempt whatsoever to gloss over the extreme emotion here. And as I say, you can't imagine Jan van Eyck doing anything as powerful as this. I mean, he'd do symbolic weeping perhaps, but not the real deal somehow. And then running over to Mary Magdalene on the other side. No, I don't have a detail of her. But anyway, the whole thing is quite extraordinary. I have to keep coming back to the technique of oil painting, because the colours are glowing and powerful, strong, fresh. The clashing of the reds and the blues and the whites. Something how that is more solid and that's a little bit more ornamental. Mary Magdalene has this wonderfully sensual outfit on over here. Maybe, again, you're sort of emphasizing her sexuality. Oh, no, look, I forgot. That's the rest of Adam over there. That was skinny bone. So anyway, go to the Prado, go to Madrid. You can have a nice time, apart from just looking at art. There's a few other good things to look at. So now, just briefly, we're off to Philadelphia, a little bit close to home. And if you're really lucky, when you go to the gallery, I talked about the importance of music in the church. You might even get some music in the art gallery. Here's a nice little string trio scraping away. And what they're scraping away in front of to this massive audience, I have no idea who took this picture. It's this image, which is really well displayed, I think, because they have kind of suggested at least an altar. This very simple stone, imitation stone backcloth, which actually kind of picks up what's in the picture itself. And then that's it here. So you can see the stone walls in the background sort of carrying over into the actual display area. And this is, it's called, the official title is The Crucifixion with the Virgin and St. John the Evangelist Mourning, M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G. About 1460-64, so quite there. And again, so a lot of these aren't highlight pictures really, but they're just interesting to look at. About 6 feet high or so a bit under 2 meters high. And I think, again, what you get is, what I'm trying to emphasize is the originality of Roger in, you have to do this sort of thing with the approval of your patron. You can't, because I'm not sure if it's exactly the same up north, but usually in Italy the deal was the patron would come to you, the master, and you would sit down, you would discuss what you were going to get, and you would sort of lay out the design, and you would probably have something, you the patron would probably have something fairly similar that you could show as a sort of demonstration piece. And usually the deal was you got about a third of the money up front, so you should run out and buy all the materials you need, and of course you got to the wood and the pigments and everything else. And then usually about halfway along, the patron could come back in, have a look, and give his approval, or hers. And then you got another third of the money. Then you got the final third on delivery, basically. And so that means that the patron still, it was sort of his picture, basically. So you had control. But either Roger was very persuasive because he's doing so many different and weird and wonderfully interesting things, or the patrons didn't really know what art was supposed to look like, which is another good possibility. Because if they were very good, that's why I think it's important to do things like this for private patrons rather than for the church. Because the church, they knew what art should be like. They knew the dogma of Christianity. So again, they would impose their will much more than the private person who might just like something beautiful to hang in his house. So again, this is something that would have been, I mean, it's not small by any means, but you know, to put on top of your chest, your drawers or something in the bedroom, but it's still perhaps, I don't know, not maybe quite big enough to be in a church. But what it is, it's a diptych. Remember all the way back to the very first thing, the Wilton diptych? Just two panels folding over rather than the triptych, the more normal triptych type things we've seen. I think an absolutely brilliant piece of theatre, again, to sort of isolate the figures, Christ on the one side, Mary and John the Evangelist on the other side, against this brick wall, but hanging these great red sheets behind them to set the figures off. The background, I think, maybe at one time was gilded, painted with gold paint. But I don't think there was ever any landscape, because you know that you could wander off to the Jerusalem and not pay attention to what's going on in the foreground. That wouldn't be much good. You think of all the details. My criticism in some ways is there's almost too much going on. I mean, you're just so busy looking at all the bits and the pieces and the wonderful outfits and the hairdos and everything else that you sort of get distracted from what you're supposed to be thinking about. And this is just absolutely focused in on the main business at hand, basically. And when we look at Christ, because more and more, I mean, it's hard to say if that was done from a real model or not. I mean, some of it is very anatomically correct, and then other bits are perhaps a little bit almost skeletal somehow. But at least you're starting, I think, I mean, people like, again, the Limburg brothers, they never looked at a live model and just sort of get in the way. But I think, you see, the way that the chest bulges up here, I've told some of you before, but because years ago, I was a model at the Edinburgh Art College. Me and Sean Connery, look what happened to him, the poor guy. And actually it was good, because that was in the early 60s when they were just ferociously against any drawing from the live model. So you'd come out and boo, and you know, you'd slink back behind your screen and smoke a cigarette. But somebody decided we were going to do a crucifixion. And so obviously I was the proper choice to pose for it. And luckily they didn't nail me up, but they strung me up. And it was because the thing was, you see, this is all a kind of almost an artistic convention, not to get too bloody about it, but you can see that actually there were huge arguments about whether or not Christ had his feet side by side, and then the sort of bonus of that was gave you an extra nail, 1, 2, 3, 4 nails for good, you know, relics and things. But you didn't actually crucify someone like this. First of all, if you nail through the hands, you would just pop right out. So you would nail through the wrist, or you would tie the person up. But also, because the fun of crucifixion was to drag it out as long as possible. Could be for days and days and days. And so you would actually, you sort of crouched, you squatted on a little platform, and that took the weight off, basically. And that was what I found out in my courses. Again, they just hang me up, they dangle me. You go home and try that, and just, you know, strip yourself out for a bit. I honestly, I'd say after 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes, I was screaming to be cut down because I was suffocating. Because, you know, everything, I mean, even if you do that for too long, you just, you know, so that's how you would eventually die on the cross. But the more weight you had on your feet, then, again, probably starvation, and all the poking and things that people would do to you as they were going by. It was the entertainment business. And we go to movies, they had the real thing. So anyway, that was again, I don't know exactly when they decided that, you know, in art, that was how you would do it, but that's usually what we get now. So here he is dangling away. A little bit too much starch in the loincloth, I think, the way that comes springing out there. But even there, little shadows going back there, again, punching things up. Even the cloth, talked about, he could have just ironed it out and smoothed it out and just made a nice flat, you know, got his roller out and a nice red surface behind. You all have all the pleats and the fold and things like that. So there's that kind of perfectionism that comes out. The inscription up there, if you can just read that, it says I-N-R-I. And that was again part of, you know, the crown of thorns. You know, in Latin, well, the translation, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. So that was mocking, all this mocking and spitting at him and things during the leading up to the crucifixion. And then, yes, who back down there, again, even there, he's put a little hill, a little bit of a shadow underneath. Not the best skull, I have to admit. I think this is rather clever, though, because see how with Mary and John sort of falling back on the other side, you've actually thrown a little bit of Mary's drapery, as if behind the frame and coming into the second panel, as if the frame is sort of, you know, getting in the way of an actual scene that's just beyond it somehow. That's quite clever. And then, again, this high emotionalism of Mary and John, very turbulent. The artists discovered very soon, I think, that if you kind of billow out the drapery and you have the sort of you know, wind-blown qualities there, that reflects the kind of spiritual anguish that's going on, the internal, external stuff. So here again, virtually no colour whatsoever, which makes the red that much more striking, I think, in behind the figures. With Mary again swooning back, wringing her hands. I mean, that's a very common theme, obviously, for actually all through the 90s. I mean, if I had a nickel for every wringing hands in English Victorian art, there's all these women who are falling from grace, always wringing their hands. It's a wonderful motif for showing, again, a kind of passion somehow. And have I got any details? No, I can't go into any more, but again, the idea of the physical emotion coming out is really quite strong. So this is now where you all start to behave yourself, because this is probably Roget's, sort of by the square yard, is certainly his biggest picture. And this is The Last Judgment, where literally the idea of an image like this was to scare you straight. Because you just, you know, you see what's going to come if you don't behave yourself, and so you do. And where it is, though, and I'll tell you how it is. 44 to 48 are the dates I've got, and it's nearly 18 feet wide, which is pretty damn big, which takes it out. I mean, not quite as wide as this room, but pretty big. 7.5 feet high, over 2 meters high. And where it is, it's still, well, actually it's been moved, but it's still where it was painted was for the hospital, the poorhouse. And I mentioned this before, in this town called Beaune, B-E-A-U-N-E. And this is the place that was built by him, by Chancellor Nicholas Rollin, as part of his kind of ticket to heaven process. You do the good deeds, you commission art, you build buildings, and all of that. And well, I've never been here. It's got this most wonderful rooftop with all this very elegant tiles. The patterning, the design of that is terrific, isn't it? But anyway, in here, now it's just a big tourist attraction, obviously. But in here, well, this is just a fun, I do a manuscript. That's Nicholas Rollin again, like a total utter weasel there. And this is the Duke of Burgundy, lots of groveling going on. And I'm assuming this is his son, that, again, we'll meet him a bit again today, Charles the Good. And look, see, they've all got all the grand people have the Order of the Golden Fleece. But he doesn't, so he hasn't made it up that high. But somebody's presenting this nice big book to the Duke. All very aristocratic with nice dogs and things like that. So, anyway, what is it inside? I'm not sure if it's been shown on TV that recently. Actually, speaking of TV, I'm going to do on Saturday at 5 o'clock, you can see me on TVO. I've done two things for them. One on Michelangelo, one on an English artist called Lancia, who nobody's heard of, but he's really quite good. Sort of from the sublime to the ridiculous. And it was done ages ago. And anyway, I guess it's a slow news day or something, so they're showing it again. But actually, if you go on my website, which I can tell you about if you want, there's a link to the TVO thing anyway, you can see it there. Anyway, there was a show called, what was it called? Art of the Western World by someone called Michael Wood, who was rather good because people who do television arty series tend to be either very pompous. I don't know if you remember like Kenneth Clark. I mean, he was really good, but he was kind of arrogant. He was Lord Clark and this sort of thing. And then all the way down the scale to Sister Wendy. Has anybody even seen Sister Wendy anymore?
She was nun? You say nun?
She was the nun, and she was amazing. I mean, she was, well, first of all, not to get too distracted, she was a total fraud in some ways, because she was a real nun, and she took a vow of silence, and then she broke it, and she couldn't shut up after that, because she was the most chatty lady ever. But she did this amazing series, and she went off to the Harvard and all these other, they must have shot at 2 in the morning when nobody's in the galleries. And you would think a nun, she'd be talking about sweet baby Jesus and vases of flowers. Oh, look at the pubic hair on that. Oh, you just run your hands through it. It was just hysterical. But the thing was, she wore this full robe, top to bottom. And her order actually hadn't worn those robes for years. But nobody would watch her on TV if she was wearing a skirt and blouse. And she was tiny and she had little buck teeth and she would go on and on about it. And then at the end of every show, she would sort of spin around and walk off into the sunset with her robes sort of flying out behind her. And I always wanted to be Brother Francis, and I wanted to go on the road with Sister Wendy, and we'd sort of go off arm in arm together at the end of each show. But she said some really stupid things, but she also said some really good things, and it got people looking at art. And it sort of made everything accessible in a way. But she became an institution. If you went to chapters, as opposed to Harry Potter, there'd be a Sister Wendy table with all of her stuff and little kind of homilies that she would write, and she was an industry. Actually, a friend of mine was sitting having a cream tea in a posh hotel in London, and there were 3 businessmen sitting at the next table with an empty seat, and suddenly the great breeze comes, and in comes Sister Wendy, still wearing the full outfit, plonks herself down at the table next to my friend, and downs a couple of martinis, and then they start talking business, because that's what it was. She was an industry. And she was supposed to come to Toronto a while ago, but she got sick, so she may actually not be with us anymore. Anyway, that's my little distraction for the day. Michael Wood was actually sort of in between, and he was sort of like your cousin George, taking you around and showing you stuff. He was very good. And he came in here, because this is the room. See, as I say, this was the poor house. And it's still set up the way it always was. And he's walking down the middle, and he's showing you, because these beds are quite deep, you've got 3 to a bed, basically, and you lay in the beds, presumably dying, and as you lay in bed, you gaze towards the Last Judgment. And that would be your final vision of the last days, basically. So again, it's the context. Now, I've never been there, but I think it's sort of taken out and more sort of shown in the sort of galleries. But it's actually, if you're going to die anyway, you might as well die here. It's rather a nice space, isn't it, with all these painted beams up on the ceiling. It'll be okay. It depends who you're in bed with, the 2 other people. That might get a bit annoying. Anyway, so that's again, you have to keep remembering where these things are, where they're designed to go. So this is, again, I think this is about as traditional as Roger would get, because you don't mess around with the last Judgment, even again, not to get too far over. Giotto in the Arena Chapel, the Scrovegni place, remember the fellow with the father that he's sort of trying to get out of purgatory by doing good deeds. Absolutely the most innovative art ever in the 13th century, or the 14th century. But the Last Judgment is actually rather conservative, because again, everybody had an idea of what a Last Judgment was supposed to look at, so you couldn't mess around with it that much. So it is very old-fashioned, it is very powerful, just I think because it's such a traditional theme. On the outside, when we fold up, because again, even here, even on this grand scale, you can fold up the outer wings, and you get Nicolas Rolin himself, yet again. This is Mrs. Roland, no idea what her name was. You've got an Annunciation up there. Remember the Ghent altarpiece, the grisaille, the greyish, as if it's sculpture with nice shadows. This is Saint Sebastian. And I hope we meet him again, because I don't want to get too distracted once more now about the story of him being shot full of arrows, but it's quite a good one. And this is St. Anthony. To be honest, I can't remember why he's got a bell and a pig. But anyway, you could all go and look that up if you wanted. But more of these sort of sculptural type things, and on little pedestals like the outside of the Ghent altarpiece to emphasize the sculptural quality. So that's the outside, again, praying mightily for the good of their own souls, presumably. On the inside, again, we sort of come zooming in, and the central, well, up at the top, left and right beside Christ, you have, we've met these before, but not quite as clearly, they're called the Arma Christi, the A-R-M-A-C-H-R-I-S-T-I, the weapons of Christ, basically. Because all the instruments of the crucifixion, basically, the things that killed him, basically that's the reverse of that. He uses them for his triumph over death. So you've got the things like the cross itself, obviously. This is the crown of thorns being held there. I'm not sure if that's the one on the other side. Yeah, that's the... I don't know why he's got a big long thing, because the other things are over here. The sponge. Again, you've got to read it, because some of this is in the Bible, some of it isn't. When Christ cries out, he's thirsty, cries out for water, some charming fellow dips a sponge in vinegar, passes it up to him. That's the fifth wound with the sword, or the spear that goes into his side. That, if you can just see next to that, that's the whip, rather nasty looking whip with the flagellation when he's almost flayed alive before the crucifixion, tied to a column that you can see there. So that's the other weapon you see there. And you can see how he sits here. Again, that kind of Byzantine wound, scared with a lily on one side, sort of an olive branch, if you like, and the sword on the other. So again, it's very much we've seen that before, the body language, left and right. Right is good, and the right side, in every sense, adroit, dexterous, all the other words for right that are good. And remember, the Latin for left is sinister. So all the bad stuff happens that's the sort of devil's side. So what you see with the Last Judgment, and this is quite common, you have to go watch the gladiator movies, because when the gladiator, one is being pinned to the ground by the other one, looks up to the emperor, and it's either thumbs up to live or thumbs down to die. And I don't think they ever actually did that, but against sort of another good sort of Hollywood convention. But it's a little bit like that here. It's sort of the right hand thumbs up, and pointing heavenwards for the blessed, the saved, and the other hand sort of pointing more downwards. And sitting on the sort of arc of the heaven, on this arc like a big rainbow, displaying the wounds of the 5 wounds of the crucifixion. Zoom in a little bit more. Yeah, that's pretty good. And this below him is St. Michael, one of the 4 archangels: Gabriel, Michael, and Raphael, and who's the other archangel? Oriel. And they don't have that busy a job, do they, the other two? And in fact, even Gabriel, I think about the only thing he does is an annunciation. How long would that take? Yeah, then you're off. And Michael, I mean, they do have other little things, but his main function is to hold the scales. Well, first of all, his main function is to look unbelievably wonderful with this incredible outfit. We'll see later on that the angels very often wear the robes of priests. In fact, even the most famous of all images I can think of angels, the Portinari altarpiece by Hugo van der Goes, we get to that in maybe next Wednesday. The angels are all differentiated by their sort of classes of importance, but also they're wearing robes equivalent of bishops and deacons and people like that. The act is, the church on earth compared to the church in heaven. So he's got his wonderful wings made of peacock feathers. This is the day of the last trump. So all these trumpeting angels here making a hell of a racket. And I think I mentioned this before, the idea of the scales being out of whack, because the damned are weighed down with sin. And I mean, that's what I should have mentioned, the business about Reuben's, all his people raising the cross, because Christ is taking the weight of all our sins with him, so he weighs 8 tons. You need all this army of muscle men to lift him up. So that's weight of sin there, and the blessed on this side looking fairly smug, going up that way. And on either side of this ark of the heaven is, again, sort of a spread out dioceses. You've got Mary on this side, you've got John the Baptist on that side. And behind them, well, and again, you can see people, because on Judgment Day, we're all going to come popping out of the earth. That's why some people aren't that keen on cremation, because it's difficult to, it's all about these dry bones that are going to have flesh put back on them, and it's hard if you just a bit of dust. Anyway, we won't worry too much about that. In behind them, it's always something like judge and jury, because the other figures of the disciples and or various saints sitting around looking around. And in behind, on this side behind Mary, is a group led by Peter, and on behind John the Baptist is a group led by St. Paul. The big two, Peter and Paul. And Peter wasn't a disciple, but he wasn't one of the people hanging around with Christ, when he came along a little bit later on. And in next to him, and behind him, there are disciples there. But there's a young virginal-looking type woman, there's a princess-type woman, and there's an old widow woman. So 3 female figures in behind St. Peter, again with disciples next to him. And people want that to be, and it could be right, to be a self-portrait of Roger again. I guess as John the Evangelist. Could be. Anyway, behind them, a pope, a bishop, a king, and a monk. And almost certainly the monk is a portrait of the fellow who is actually coming up with all of the program. See, again, you have to think of the artist as being relatively uneducated and not knowing quite what. The best case might be Botticelli, who would have been totally uneducated and produces these amazingly complex mythological works like Primavera and the Birth of Venus. So he had a little committee, if you like, of philosophers and poets to help him out. In the case of religious art, of course, you'd have your theologian who would tell you what to do and where to put it, basically. And it's always thought that this is actually Nicholas Rona's confessor, who you think must have been a really busy fellow. But he obviously, if you're going to come up with a program, you're going to stick yourself in it to make sure that you're numbered in with the blessed. You're not going to put yourself on the other side with all the doomed people. So anyway, that's probably him there. I'd like to think that might be Roger as well in this part. Anyway, back to the downside, and I can't zoom in that much, but on the far left-hand side, which of course is on God's right, you have literally the sort of pearly gates, the kingdom of heaven. And they haven't, nowadays, it's supposed to be St. Peter who's standing there, shaking everybody's hand, come on in. And now it's yet another angel welcoming, still naked. See, they're coming out of the ground, and the kind of flesh is coming onto their bones, and that's always rather good. And so here they are, happily prancing off into their eternal life over there, their reward for being good. And on the other side, of course, the exact opposite. They're coming out of the ground, and oh God, we blew it. And the main they're almost like Adam and Eve, aren't they? Being driven out of the Garden of Eden, because we've seen that so often. So there's certainly a suggestion of the fall of man, the sort of original thing, but hugely, highly emotional, all the almost caricature-y expression. It's almost too much. But you have to remember those people all lying in those beds, looking at the things from 50, 75 feet away at least. You have to, it's like acting on stage, you have to make the gestures slightly bigger than you would in real life, just to make them legible. So, if you had calm features on these figures, the people in the cheap seats in the back row wouldn't know what you were talking about. So you just kind of punch everything up a little bit. And all the gestures, the expressions, all in that sense. And see, the thing is that, you never bother really to show the blessed, because they're completely boring and just go, oh, thank you very much. The artists always, I mean, when we get to Bosch, they have much more fun, and even Giotto himself, all the munching and the chewing and the guzzling of all these horrible damned souls. And look at being a woman, she's actually very lovely, this figure here, look at that, almost balletic, the way she's being pulled down by her hair. And we've seen so often the idea of hair being, you know, on Mary Magdalene, on the Virgin, that beautiful, you know, the hair fetish, as I've said, that the artists have. But also, I think, sort of, depending on the context, long, beautiful hair could be a symbol of luxury. And luxury was one of the 7 deadly sins that basically doom you to perpetual damnation. So all you ladies with nice, long, lovely hair, watch it. Because somebody will grab you. And then they're all, again, these sort of scary things going on there. And again, people just tumbling head over heels into the abyss. That's quite good. So again, behave yourselves. Otherwise, this is what you're going to get. That was the point. Remember, everybody, the context of this, that everybody looking at this is on the brink of death. So, but it's not too late. That's the good thing about Christianity. If you genuinely repent your sins, even on your deathbed, say, I'm sorry, I really didn't mean it. If you really do mean it, then you'll be okay. But if you don't, then they'll get you anyway. So you can't fake it at that particular point. I don't think. I'm sort of rather hoping you can, but I suspect you can't. Anyway, that's, as I said, that's all this rather good imaginative stuff. But I bet if you really bothered, you get nice toes, by the way. Yeah, that's good. If you bother to really check around, you might find quite a lot of stuff, particularly in manuscripts. We'll see that. No, I won't be able to prove it that much, but a lot of the Bosch's symbolism. If you're still looking ahead to get a good essay on it, look at Bosch, which is terrific. A lot of what he gets is from these manuscripts, from the borders, all sorts of wonderful silly stuff happens there, because by monks who are bored silly and they just do imaginative, clever things in the margins that they think maybe nobody's going to catch them at it somehow. So there's a kind of, in a way, a common language, they usually call grotesqueries and things like that. So, you know, maybe there's a tradition with this sort of thing, but certainly Roger does it awfully well. So actually, no, it's 20 to 4, so I won't start this, but so come back right at 4 o'clock, and I do want to talk about the midterm. Maybe I'll wait till the very end, but I've said most of what I know already anyway, but just to repeat things for you. So 4 o'clock, we're back here. Actually, do you want to do it now? Because Robert is going to explain the